Hello everyone. My name is Haidar Karaulis. I'm going to be presenting our work today titled Sovereign Data Exchange in Cloud Connected IoT using International Data Spaces. This paper is done by two Fraunhofer Institutes and funded through the Silicon Economy Logistics Ecosystem project. So, to motivate our work, we have to talk about the importance of data and data sovereignty. So, in this day and age, everyone generates data, and the sensitivity and importance of this data is ever more increasing. And this raises the issue of data sovereignty, or who has control and how of their data. And that was on one hand. On the other hand, IoT, Internet of Things devices, is also increasing in popularity, and they are everywhere basically. From here we can see on the right, powering warehouses, robotic AGV systems, and also in our homes, for example, here on the bottom left, a robotic vacuum that and these types of devices always generate data, and they let's say phone home. So who has control of the data that a robotic vacuum generates? Who is the owner of this data and how to handle it? So this also raises the issue of data sovereignty in the field of IoT. So, and in general, data sovereignty is, like I said, it's maintaining control of one's data. And there are multiple approaches currently under development. The most documented and specified standard of which is the international data spaces, which relies on existing protocols, and it's based on the data exchange is based on usage constraints, and this is how um, using usage constraints is how the data provider can make sure that their data is under their control even though it left. So the provider sets constraints to their data, to how their data is used, and a data consumer must agree to this usage constraint. And this is an active check process. So it's always being checked at every data request. So here, for example, we see in the picture to the right, we have company one and company two, and these companies, if they wish to exchange data, for example, if company one is a provider, company two has to agree the terms and constraints provided by company one before accessing its data. And the international data spaces has an added layer of assurance to this process by using certified components. So company one, for example, and company two can only access the international data spaces through certified IDS components, for example, an IDS connector. So, and in terms of data sovereignty, the existing work is limited because data sovereignty itself has heavy overheads, and it's mainly designed for server or data center use, where resource consumption and is not an issue. And to this point, there are not many work that support IoT on-device deployment of such IDS components. And in terms of IoT, there's also lacking definitions in the IDS, how devices can communicate with each other. So in our work, we attempt to address this research gap, and we have adapted two known communication models, namely the publish, subscribe, and request response communication models. And from those models, we define suitable IDS message exchange sequences, and we implement those approaches in the sample implementation and evaluate our approaches with a focus on resource consumption because IoT is our main goal here. So, um, in our first proposed scheme, it's based on publish subscribe, and we have two main stages. So here we have two main stages. The first stage is the request, the request of the resource or the data request, and the second stage we have here the receiving updates. So in this scenario, we can envision a scenario here where a consumer and a provider exchange data. They exchange specific IDS messages, and in our defined sequence, uh, the consumer first initiates a data request because an IDS the base of IDS is a request response model to ensure that the owner always has control of who has access to their data. So in this case, the consumer sends a description request message to request the resource information from the provider. The provider provides this information via a description response message. This contains the metadata that the consumer needs to request the specific resource. So from here on out, the consumer then sends an IDS artifact request message for that specific resource, and this artifact request message, contains the metadata for that specific resource. The provider then, once the usage constraints have been accepted, sends the data back in an artifact response message. Now, to simulate, to have the publish subscribe scheme here, the consumer sends another request to the provider in the form of another artifact request message, but here sends it to send a subscription request for the provider, so that the provider marks down that this consumer needs updates for this data, and then the provider confirms this subscription via an artifact response message. So these are two main substages, let's say, in the resource request phase, and once the provider updates the resource, updates the data, or includes new usage constraints and so on, it has the list of subscribers to this resource, and the provider sends an IDS resource update message in the updates phase to the consumers. And here the consumer responds to this resource update message. And these update messages contain only a notification that the specific resource has been updated. To ensure data control, the update messages do not contain the actual data. The consumer has to then react to this and send an artifact request message again to request the updated data, which the provider again forwards back using an artifact request message. Once this process is done, the consumer then notifies the provider that the resource update process was done successfully, and responds with a message process notification message. And this concludes the receiving updates phase. So next, we have our second proposal for communication is based on the request response scheme. Here we have two main phases: the data request phase in the form of requesting the resource, and we have the requesting updates phase, which can take also in the form of polling or a loop. In this scenario, the consumer sends a data request here, a description request message, similar to before, and then receives the data after sending an artifact request message. What's missing here is the subscription, as the consumer here makes sure that he or she has the latest data available by sending artifact request messages always, whenever needed, whenever an update is needed. So this method again is after each artifact request message, the provider checks whether the usage constraints are met, and if not, they send a rejection message instead of an artifact response message. So to evaluate this approach, we developed a simulated test bed containing cloud connected IoT automated guided vehicles, or AGVs for short, and a third-party system, in this case a control center. This scenario simulates an airport baggage collection robots, and in the AGVs they have a backend system that's working, connected to a data space connector through an adapter. And in the third-party system, similarly, they have a backend system here, control interface, connected to a data space connector through an adapter. And the entire setup is monitored through a monitoring stack. And for our experiments, we vary the durations, the running durations of the system, with also with each experiment we repeat it for 30 times to generate more data. So in our first results, we monitor the CPU usage of the IDS connected components in the AGV, and here in this scenario we send a job finish notification after 60 seconds, so the system goes in low power mode. Here in the publish subscribe approach, we can see here that an initial spike is done when the request for data and subscription are sent, and then the system goes in a low power state until a notification is received, and then the job is finished. But in the request response approach, the system keeps polling the provider every 5 seconds and to check whether new updates are or new notifications are available. Here we don't see the spike at the beginning because the system does not request to subscribe, therefore it's missing that overhead, and it maintains a relatively stable CPU usage throughout the duration. And if we take a longer duration, we see an enlarged effect of the same behavior. Here in the publish subscribe approach and in 180-second scenario, we see the similar spike, but the duration of wait or low power usage until the notification is much longer. Whereas in the request response approach with 180 seconds, the system keeps polling and consuming CPU resources until the notification is finally received. And we can see this also in terms of the number of IDS messages exchanged. So in the publish subscribe model, until the notification is received, we can see that there's a constant number of exchanged messages, whereas in the request response approach, the number of exchanged messages increases as the duration of the scenario also increases. So based on this, and to conclude this presentation, so as presented, we presented our proposed communication schemes for communication in the IDS, and with the main focus of IoT and studying resource consumption. So based on this, we can understand that in resource limited applications where CPU usage is must be minimized, publish subscribe based scheme is more suitable, as there is a longer period of wait between the subscription and receiving a notification and moving on. And if we have a scenario where periodic updates are arriving, so not just a single notification, the request response scheme is more suitable, as there is the spike of subscribing at the beginning that does not exist here. And for possible future work, we can apply this scenario in a non-simulated way and have enhanced parameter studies where we study the frequency of the messages, and we can explore how this scenario might work in the currently being developed IDS communication protocol, for example. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm more than glad to answer any questions if available. Thank you.